they left her to die. Deep in the Cherokee ancestral lands of the Great Smoky Mountains, Park Ranger Grace Whitehawk hung upside down from the ancient Judgment Oak, her wrists bound with climbing rope, blood pooling in her skull like a crimson tide. 6 hours. That's how long she'd been suspended, watching her life drain away drop by precious drop onto the forest floor below. Her vision swam between darkness and blinding flashes of pain. Through cracked lips, she whispered the Cherokee death prayer her father had taught her 15 years ago. Galunlati, receive my spirit. The words tasted of copper and desperation. Then, through the morning mist that clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers, it appeared. A massive shape, white as winter snow, moving with the silence of shadow itself. Ice-blue eyes locked onto hers with an intelligence that defied nature. What happened next would change everything she thought she knew about survival, loyalty, and the thin line between the living and the dead. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park stretched across the Tennessee-North Carolina border like a vast green cathedral, its ancient peaks shrouded in the mist that gave the mountains their name. For Grace Whitehawk, these sacred Cherokee lands represented both refuge and remembrance, a place where her father's spirit walked among the towering oaks and her own wounded soul might finally find peace. At 29, Grace carried herself with the disciplined posture of someone who had learned survival in harder places than these mountains. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her ranger uniform bore the crisp lines of military training that had never quite left her system. The Cherokee heritage from her father's side showed in her high cheekbones and the way she moved through the forest, silent, respectful, aware. But it was the shadows behind her brown eyes that told the real story of Grace Whitehawk. 2 tours as an Army medic in Iraq had left their mark. She'd come home 3 years ago carrying invisible wounds that no VA hospital could properly heal. The nightmares still came, desert sand and blood, the weight of soldiers she couldn't save, the constant hypervigilance that made civilian life feel like walking through a minefield. The mountains offered what the city couldn't: space to breathe, quiet to think, and work that mattered. Thomas Caldwell had been her salvation in those early days. The 52-year-old station supervisor with his Scottish accent, softened by decades in Tennessee, had taken Grace under his wing when she'd arrived at the Park Service broken and searching. His graying beard and kind eyes reminded her of her father, and his patient mentoring had slowly rebuilt her confidence. For 2 years he'd been the steady presence she'd needed, part boss, part father figure, part friend. "You've got good instincts, Grace," Thomas often said. "Trust them." The ranger station sat nestled in a valley where Cherokee families had lived for generations before the government's forced removal. Grace felt the weight of that history every morning when she reported for duty. Her father, Jacob Whitehawk, had taught her the old stories before his death 15 years ago in what everyone called a hunting accident. She still wore his Cherokee arrowhead necklace, a piece of carved bone that caught the light when she moved. Local reports had been coming in for months about a ghostly white wolf seen moving through the deep forest. Hikers claimed the creature was massive, bigger than any wolf had a right to be, with eyes like winter ice. The Cherokee elders whispered it was a spirit guardian, but Grace put no stock in such tales. She dealt in facts, evidence, the tangible world she could control. If only she had listened to the old stories. If only she had trusted her father's warnings about the Judgment Oak and the sacred places where the living should not tread. The morning mist hung thick between the trees as Grace loaded her patrol pack with methodical precision. Her hands moved automatically through the routine: water bottles, first aid kit, GPS unit, radio, emergency flares. The familiar weight of her sidearm settled against her hip, a comfort she'd never quite shaken from her military days. Thomas had assigned her the Cataract Falls sector, a remote area where few hikers ventured and even fewer rangers patrolled regularly. "Take this updated trail map," Thomas had said that morning, sliding a folded paper across his desk. "We've had reports of some unusual activity in that sector. Probably just poachers, but I want you to check it out." Grace had studied the map carefully. Several trails were marked differently than she remembered, with new red markings indicating what Thomas called updated access points. Something about the modifications nagged at her, but she trusted his judgment. He'd been working these mountains longer than she'd been alive. The drive to the trailhead took 45 minutes along winding mountain roads that carved through dense forest. Ancient oaks and maples formed a canopy so thick that sunlight filtered through in scattered golden patches. Grace parked her ranger vehicle at the old logging road terminus and shouldered her pack. The silence was profound. No traffic noise, no human voices, just the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. She followed Thomas's marked route deeper into the forest than she'd ever ventured before. The trail was barely visible, more of a deer path than anything meant for human use. After 2 hours of steady hiking, Grace began to notice signs that made her instincts prickle with unease. Broken branches at shoulder height suggested recent human passage. Footprints in the soft earth near a creek crossing showed boot treads too fresh to be from casual hikers. Then she found the first excavation site. Hidden beneath a natural rock overhang, someone had been systematically digging. The hole was roughly 6 feet square and 4 feet deep, with clean edges that spoke of careful work. Scattered around the site were tools, shovels, brushes, small screens for sifting soil. But what made Grace's blood run cold were the artifacts laid out on a blue tarp nearby. Cherokee pottery shards, arrowheads, and what looked like bone ornaments arranged with the precision of someone who knew their value. This wasn't random treasure hunting. This was organized grave robbing. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she photographed the site with her camera. Cherokee burial grounds were sacred, protected by both federal law and tribal treaty. Disturbing them was a federal crime carrying serious prison time. But more than that, for Grace, it was a desecration of her father's heritage, a violation of everything he'd taught her about respecting the ancestors who walked these mountains before them. She keyed her radio to call in the discovery, but static was all that answered. The GPS unit showed her position, but when she tried to mark the location, the screen flickered and went dark. Dead battery, despite being fully charged that morning. A branch snapped behind her. Grace spun around, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapon, but saw nothing except the endless rows of trees. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Even the wind had stilled. Every combat instinct she'd honed in Iraq screamed danger. She began moving back toward the trail, her steps careful and silent. Military training took over, head on a swivel, checking corners, listening for the slightest sound that didn't belong. But she'd only made it 50 yards when she heard voices speaking in low Cherokee dialect drifting through the trees ahead. Grace crouched behind a fallen log, straining to understand the words. Her Cherokee was rusty, learned at her father's knee but rarely used in daily life. What she caught made her heart race. The ranger knows too much. Can't let her report this. The sacred site must be protected. 3 men emerged from the forest ahead of her, blocking the path back to her vehicle. They wore military-style camouflage and moved with the coordination of people who'd worked together before. The leader, a tall Cherokee man with graying hair, carried a rifle with practiced ease. Grace recognized him from tribal gatherings. Samuel Youngbear, a respected elder she'd known since childhood. But recognition brought no comfort. His face was hard as granite, and when his eyes found hers through the trees, she saw no warmth there. "Grace Whitehawk," he called out in English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Step out where we can see you. We need to talk." Grace's mind raced through her options. 3 armed men between her and escape. No radio contact. GPS dead. The nearest help was miles away through difficult terrain. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the best choice is the one that keeps you alive to fight another day." She stood slowly, hands visible but ready. "Samuel, what's this about?" "You've seen too much, child," Samuel said, his rifle trained on her chest. "Some secrets are too dangerous for the outside world. Your father understood that. We hoped you would too." The mention of her father sent ice through Grace's veins. "What does my father have to do with this?" Samuel's expression softened slightly, but his weapon never wavered. "Jacob Whitehawk died protecting these sacred places. He wouldn't want his daughter to undo everything he sacrificed for. My father died in a hunting accident. Your father died keeping silent about what he'd discovered." Samuel's voice carried the weight of old grief. "He chose his people over the law. We hoped you'd make the same choice." The other 2 men had circled behind her while they talked. Grace felt the noose tightening, but she had to know the truth. "What did he discover?" Samuel gestured toward the excavation site. "That some secrets are worth more than life itself. That sometimes protecting what's sacred means making hard choices." Grace's hand moved instinctively toward her weapon, but she never got the chance to draw it. Something struck the back of her head with stunning force, and consciousness shattered into 1,000 brilliant fragments before darkness claimed her. Grace's consciousness returned slowly, accompanied by a throbbing pain that seemed to pulse through her entire skull. Her mouth tasted of copper and dirt, and when she tried to move, she discovered her hands were bound tightly behind her back with climbing rope. The rough bark of the ancient oak pressed against her spine as she sat propped against its massive trunk. Samuel Youngbear crouched in front of her, his weathered face grave with what might have been regret. The other 2 men, she recognized them now as his sons, Marcus and David, stood guard with their rifles at ready position. The Cherokee elder's eyes held a sadness that seemed to go deeper than the immediate situation. "I'm sorry it came to this, Grace," Samuel said quietly. "Your father was a good man. He understood what was at stake." Grace's vision cleared enough to take in her surroundings. They'd moved her deeper into the forest, to a place she'd never seen before despite years of patrolling these mountains. The oak tree behind her was enormous, easily 8 feet in diameter, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. Strange markings had been carved into its bark, Cherokee symbols that seemed to tell a story she couldn't quite read. "The Judgment Oak," Samuel continued, following her gaze upward. "Our ancestors used this place for important decisions, life and death decisions." "Samuel, whatever you think you're protecting, this isn't the way," Grace said, testing the bonds around her wrists. The rope was expertly tied, tight enough to cut off circulation but positioned so that struggling would only make it worse. "Federal agents will come looking when I don't report in." Marcus Youngbear, the younger of Samuel's sons, laughed bitterly. "No one's coming, Ranger. Your supervisor knows exactly where you are." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "Thomas Caldwell's been working with us for 2 years," Samuel explained. "Who do you think modified that trail map? Who do you think made sure your radio and GPS would fail in this sector?" Grace's mind reeled as the implications sank in. Thomas, her mentor, her friend, the man who'd helped rebuild her confidence and given her purpose, had led her into a trap. The betrayal cut deeper than the physical pain in her head. Why? She whispered. Samuel stood and walked to a canvas bag lying nearby. When he opened it, Grace could see more Cherokee artifacts: pottery, jewelry, carved figures that looked impossibly old. Because some things are worth more than government salaries. Because the outside world would never understand what these sacred objects mean to collectors who will pay any price for authentic Cherokee burial goods. "You're grave robbers," Grace said, the words tasting bitter. "All of you." "We're survivors," David Youngbear corrected. "The government took our land, destroyed our way of life, forced our people onto reservations. Now we take back what's ours and sell it to the highest bidder. It's justice." Grace struggled against her bonds, feeling the rope bite into her wrists. "This isn't justice. It's desecration. Those burial sites are sacred to your own people." "Sacred?" Samuel's voice rose with sudden anger. "You want to talk about sacred? Your government put our ancestors' bones in museums for tourists to gawk at. They sold our sacred objects to private collectors decades ago. We're just evening the score." He pulled a length of rope from his bag and began fashioning a noose with practiced efficiency. Grace's blood turned to ice as she realized what was happening. "The Judgment Oak has a long history," Samuel said conversationally as he worked. "Cherokee justice was swift and final. Those who betrayed the tribe were given to the tree." "Samuel, please," Grace said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm Cherokee too. My father—" "Your father understood loyalty," Samuel interrupted. "He found our operation 15 years ago, just like you did, but when we explained what was at stake, he agreed to keep quiet. He became part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. "What happened to him?" Samuel's hands paused in their rope work. "Sometimes accidents happen in the woods. Hunting can be dangerous, especially when people don't follow safety protocols." The truth hit Grace like a sledgehammer. "You killed him." "Thomas Caldwell killed him," Samuel corrected. "Your father got cold feet. Started talking about going to the FBI. Thomas had to make a choice. His business partner or some idealistic Cherokee who thought the law mattered more than survival." Marcus moved behind the tree and threw the rope over a thick branch about 12 feet up. When it came down the other side, he began testing the knot that would bear Grace's weight. "This isn't about Cherokee justice," Grace said desperately. "This is about money." "You're using our people's traditions to justify murder and theft." "The traditions say traitors hang from the Judgment Oak," Samuel replied, "and you've seen too much to walk away." They hauled her to her feet and positioned her directly under the hanging noose. Grace looked up at the thick branch that would be her gallows and felt terror unlike anything she'd experienced in Iraq. In combat, death came quick and clean. This would be slow strangulation, her own body weight crushing her windpipe while her feet dangled uselessly above the ground. "Any last words?" Samuel asked, almost gently. Grace closed her eyes and whispered the Cherokee death prayer her father had taught her, the same words she'd spoken hanging upside down hours earlier. But this time she added something else, a prayer to whatever spirits might be listening in these ancient woods. They slipped the noose around her neck with ceremonial precision. The rope was coarse against her skin, already cutting off circulation. Marcus and David took hold of the other end, ready to hoist her up to die slowly in the shadow of the Judgment Oak. "Wait," a new voice called from the forest. Thomas Caldwell emerged from behind a cluster of mountain laurel, his ranger uniform immaculate despite the rough terrain. But his kind eyes had been replaced by something cold and calculating. "This wasn't the plan, Samuel," Thomas said. "We agreed on an accident, a fall, maybe, something that wouldn't raise questions." Samuel shrugged. "Plans change. She knows too much, and hanging sends a message to anyone else who might get curious about Cherokee burial sites." Thomas studied Grace for a long moment, and she thought she saw a flicker of the man who'd mentored her. "Grace, I want you to know this isn't personal. Business is business. Like it was business when you murdered my father? Grace spat. Thomas flinched slightly. Jacob was my friend. I didn't want to kill him, but he was going to destroy everything we'd built. The noose tightened around Grace's throat as Marcus tested the rope's tension. In moments, they would hoist her up to strangle slowly while the 4 men who'd betrayed everything she believed in watched her die. That's when the white shape exploded from the forest undergrowth like a force of nature itself. The creature that burst from the undergrowth was unlike anything Grace had ever seen. Massive beyond belief, it stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder with the build of a wolf, but the size of a small bear. Its coat was pure white, almost luminescent in the dappled forest light, and its eyes burned with an intelligence that seemed almost human. But what struck Grace most was the network of old scars across its flanks, evidence of battles fought and survived. The white wolf moved with deadly precision. It hit Marcus Youngbear first, massive jaws clamping down on his wrist with a sickening crunch that sent his rifle spinning into the undergrowth. The man's scream echoed through the forest as he fell backward, clutching his mangled arm. David raised his weapon, but the wolf was already moving, using Marcus's falling body as a springboard to launch itself at the second brother. "Shoot it!" Thomas shouted, drawing his sidearm, but the wolf was a blur of white death moving between the trees with supernatural speed. Samuel had released his hold on the rope to grab his rifle, and Grace felt the noose slacken slightly around her throat. She twisted desperately, trying to slip free, but the knot held firm. Blood pounded in her temples as she watched the chaos unfold around her. The wolf, she couldn't think of it as anything else despite its impossible size, seemed to be fighting with tactical intelligence. It used the terrain to its advantage, ducking behind trees to avoid gunfire, then emerging to strike at exposed flanks. When David tried to circle around for a clear shot, the creature anticipated the movement and was waiting for him. But it was more than just predatory instinct. The wolf's attacks were precise, targeting weapons and hands rather than going for killing strikes to the throat. It fought like something that understood the difference between neutralizing a threat and committing murder. "What the hell is that thing?" David gasped, nursing deep claw marks across his chest. Samuel's weathered face had gone pale. "It's the white wolf, the one the elders talk about. The spirit guardian." "It's just an animal," Thomas snarled, taking careful aim with his pistol. "A big, angry animal." The wolf's ice-blue eyes fixed on Thomas with unmistakable recognition and hatred. A low growl rumbled from its chest, a sound like distant thunder that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a series of barks and whines that Grace's Cherokee-trained ear recognized as deliberate communication. Her father had taught her some of the old ways, including how Cherokee hunters had once communicated with their animal companions. This creature was trying to tell her something, its vocalizations following the pattern of Cherokee animal speech that few people remembered anymore. "Easy," Grace whispered in Cherokee, the words barely audible through her constricted throat. "Friend, I understand." The wolf's ears perked forward at the familiar language, its massive head tilted, studying her face with those eerily intelligent eyes. Then it made a decision that would have seemed impossible for a wild animal. Ignoring the armed men around it, the wolf approached Grace with deliberate calm. It circled her once, then twice, its nose working as it catalogued her scent. When it came around the third time, it reared up on its hind legs and placed its front paws on her shoulders, bringing its face level with hers. Up close, Grace could see that this was no ordinary wolf. The bone structure was wrong, too heavy, too broad through the skull. And those eyes held a depth of intelligence that spoke of something more than wild instinct. Old scars crisscrossed its muzzle, and one ear bore the notched mark of a long-ago injury. The wolf studied her face for a long moment, then lowered its head to examine the Cherokee arrowhead necklace hanging against her throat. Its nostrils flared as it caught some scent that seemed to excite it. When it looked back up at her, Grace could have sworn she saw recognition in those blue depths. "Impossible," she breathed. The wolf dropped back to all fours and began circling the base of the Judgment Oak, its massive head tilted back to study the hanging rope. It made several soft, whining sounds, then looked directly at Grace and barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that somehow conveyed urgent intent. "Get away from her!" Thomas shouted, advancing with his pistol raised. "I don't know what kind of freak of nature you are, but—" The wolf spun toward him with lightning speed, lips pulled back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers. The growl that emerged from its throat was unlike anything in nature, deeper than any wolf should be capable of, with harmonics that suggested vocal cords designed for more complex communication. Thomas stopped dead, his weapon trembling in his hands. Even Samuel and his wounded sons had gone still, watching this impossible confrontation between man and beast. The creature turned back to Grace and began doing something that defied every law of animal behavior she knew. It started climbing the oak tree. Its claws found purchase in the deeply grooved bark, and despite its massive size, it ascended with the agility of a much smaller animal. Grace watched in amazement as it worked its way up the trunk toward the branch where the rope was secured. The physics seemed all wrong. Nothing that heavy should be able to climb like that, but the wolf moved with practiced ease as if it had done this before. "It's trying to free her," David whispered, wonder and fear warring in his voice. "Shoot it down," Samuel ordered, but his sons made no move to comply. They were transfixed by the sight of this massive predator performing what could only be described as a rescue operation. The wolf reached the branch and began working at the rope with surgical precision. Its teeth were designed for tearing flesh, not cutting fiber, but it applied them with the focused intelligence of someone solving a complex problem. Each bite was calculated, targeting the rope's weakest points where the fibers had been stressed by Grace's weight. Thomas raised his pistol and fired. The shot echoed through the forest like a thunderclap, and bark exploded from the tree trunk inches from the wolf's head. The creature didn't even flinch. It continued its methodical work on the rope, completely focused on the task of freeing Grace. A second shot rang out, this one closer, and Grace saw a line of red appear along the wolf's ribs. It was hit, but not seriously wounded. The wolf paused in its work just long enough to fix Thomas with a stare that seemed to promise terrible retribution, then returned to chewing through the rope. "Why won't it die?" Thomas screamed, firing wildly now. The answer came with a sharp crack as the rope finally parted. Grace felt the noose slacken around her throat, and she gasped in her first full breath in what felt like hours. The wolf scrambled down the tree with impossible grace and immediately began working at the bonds around her wrists with the same precise technique. Within moments, her hands were free. Grace pulled the noose from around her neck and stumbled backward against the oak's massive trunk, her legs barely able to support her weight. The wolf positioned itself between her and the four men, its hackles raised and teeth bared in unmistakable warning. But Thomas was beyond reason now, reloading his pistol with shaking hands. "I won't let some freak animal ruin everything we've built. 15 years of work, millions of dollars in artifacts." The wolf gathered itself for a charge, muscles bunching under its white coat. Grace could see the intelligence in its eyes calculating distance, trajectory, the precise moment to strike for maximum effect. "Wait," she whispered in Cherokee, placing a hand on the creature's back. Its fur was coarser than she'd expected, and beneath it she could feel the corded muscle of a predator in its prime. "Not yet." The wolf's head turned toward her, and in that moment of connection, Grace felt something impossible, a sense of familiarity, of coming home to something she'd lost long ago. Those blue eyes held secrets she was only beginning to understand. Thomas finished reloading and raised the weapon with deadly intent. But before he could fire, the forest erupted with the sound of approaching engines and the sharp bark of official radios. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" The cavalry had finally arrived. The forest erupted into chaos as federal agents poured through the trees from 3 directions, their tactical gear and assault rifles creating a stark contrast to the ancient Cherokee setting. Agent Sarah Chen led the charge, her FBI windbreaker bright against the green undergrowth as she advanced with her weapon trained on Thomas Caldwell. "Drop the weapon now!" she commanded, her voice cutting through the mountain air with practiced authority. Thomas's face went ashen as he realized the magnitude of his situation. The pistol trembled in his hands as he looked wildly between the advancing agents and the massive white wolf that still stood protectively in front of Grace. For a moment, it seemed he might surrender peacefully. Then desperation took hold. "You don't understand," Thomas shouted, backing toward the excavation site. "We were preserving Cherokee heritage. The government would have just locked these artifacts away in some warehouse where no one would ever see them." Agent Chen's expression remained impassive. "Mr. Caldwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, grave robbing, and violation of the Native American Graves Protection Act. Put down your weapon." Samuel Youngbear, still clutching his rifle despite his son's obvious injuries, stepped forward with the dignity of a man who'd accepted his fate. "The artifacts belong to our people. We were taking back what was stolen from us generations ago." "By murdering anyone who discovered your operation?" Grace found her voice at last, though her throat still burned from the rope. "By killing my father when he tried to stop you?" The white wolf's head swiveled toward her at the sound of her words, and again Grace felt that uncanny sense of recognition in its ice-blue eyes. The creature moved closer to her side, its massive bulk providing comfort and protection even as armed federal agents surrounded them. Marcus Youngbear, cradling his mangled wrist, spoke through gritted teeth. "Your father was going to destroy everything. He'd rather see sacred Cherokee artifacts moldering in government storage than sold to collectors who would treasure them." "Collectors who would pay millions for them, you mean?" Agent Chen corrected. "We've been tracking your operation for 6 months, Mr. Youngbear. We know about the international buyers, the auction houses in Europe, the private collectors who don't ask questions about provenance." Grace felt the world spinning around her as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "How long?" she whispered. "How long has this been going on?" Thomas's shoulders sagged in defeat. 15 years. Ever since your father found the first burial site and threatened to report it. We tried to reason with him, explain how much money was involved, how we could all benefit, but Jacob was stubborn. He cared more about dusty old bones than providing for his family. The words hit Grace like physical blows. Her father hadn't died in a hunting accident. He'd been murdered for trying to protect sacred Cherokee burial grounds from grave robbers who happened to include his supposed friend and hunting partner. "You killed him in cold blood," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was an accident at first," Thomas said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "We were arguing about what to do with the artifacts we'd found. Jacob grabbed for my rifle and it went off. But then Samuel convinced me we could make it look intentional, stage it as a hunting accident. We figured it would be better than trying to explain why we were fighting over Cherokee grave goods." The white wolf's growl rumbled like distant thunder, and Grace realized the creature was responding to the emotional pain in her voice. Its massive head pressed against her leg in what could only be described as a gesture of comfort. Agent Chen gestured to her team, and they began spreading out to secure the scene. "We'll need statements from everyone, but first let's get medical attention for the wounded and secure the evidence." "The artifacts," Samuel said, his voice heavy with resignation. "They're all here. 15 years' worth of Cherokee burial goods, pottery, jewelry, ceremonial objects that belonged to our ancestors. Grace looked toward the excavation site and felt sick. Dozens of irreplaceable cultural artifacts lay scattered on tarps, like common merchandise. Each piece represented a person who had lived and died on this land centuries ago, someone who had been buried with objects meant to accompany them to the spirit world. "How could you?" she asked Samuel. "These were your own ancestors." Samuel's weathered face hardened. "My ancestors were driven from this land at gunpoint. Their burial sites were bulldozed to make way for roads and shopping centers. If any of their grave goods survived, it was only because they were hidden so well that even the government couldn't find them. We were the last generation who knew where they were buried." "So you decided to cash in on that knowledge," Agent Chen observed coldly. "We decided to ensure our people's survival," Samuel replied with dignity. "The money from these sales funded scholarships for Cherokee children, medical care for our elders, legal fights to protect what little land we have left. The buyers may have been outsiders, but the money stayed in the Cherokee community." David Youngbear, still bleeding from his chest wounds, looked up from where a paramedic was treating him. "Easy to judge when you don't know what it's like to watch your people struggle while their sacred objects gather dust in museum basements." Grace felt torn between understanding and revulsion. As someone of Cherokee heritage herself, she knew the history of exploitation and cultural destruction that Samuel referenced. But she also knew that desecrating burial sites was a betrayal of everything their ancestors had believed about the sanctity of death and the afterlife. The white wolf seemed to sense her internal conflict. It moved to position itself directly in front of her, those intelligent blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that was almost human. When it vocalized again, the sounds it made followed the pattern of Cherokee communication her father had taught her, a series of barks and whines that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple animal expression. "What is it, boy?" Grace whispered, reaching out to touch the creature's massive head. Its fur was coarser than she'd expected, and beneath her fingers she could feel old scars that spoke of a hard life in the wilderness. Agent Chen noticed the interaction with professional interest. "That's quite an animal. I've never seen anything like it." "Where did it come from?" "The Cherokee have stories about white wolves," Grace said softly. "Spirit guardians who appear when the sacred places are threatened. My father used to tell me about them when I was little." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "Spirit guardians? It's just a freak of nature, probably some kind of hybrid, wolf and dog, maybe even some Arctic breed that escaped from a zoo. There's nothing mystical about it." But as the white wolf turned its attention to Thomas, Grace saw something in its eyes that made her breath catch. Recognition, not just of an enemy, but of someone specific. Someone it remembered. The creature stalked toward Thomas with deliberate intent, its lips pulling back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers. The federal agents tensed, ready to intervene, but the wolf stopped just out of arm's reach and sat back on its haunches. It tilted its massive head and studied Thomas's face with the intensity of someone taking a photograph for future reference. "It knows you," Grace breathed. "Somehow it knows you." Thomas's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. I've never seen this animal before in my life." But the wolf's behavior suggested otherwise. It circled Thomas once, then twice, its nose working as it catalogued scents. When it completed its investigation, it returned to Grace's side and pressed against her leg again, as if seeking comfort from a memory too painful to bear alone. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place in Grace's mind. The wolf's obvious intelligence, its knowledge of the forest, the way it had responded to Cherokee language and seemed to recognize both her and Thomas. Most importantly, the scars that marked its body, evidence of violence that might not have come from natural predators. 15 years ago, Grace said slowly, When my father was killed, was there anything else? Anyone else who might have been hurt? Thomas's silence was answer enough. Samuel Youngbear looked away, unable to meet her eyes. The white wolf moved closer to Grace, and for the first time since its dramatic appearance, it seemed vulnerable. Its massive head drooped slightly, and a soft, whining sound emerged from its throat, the sound of an animal in emotional pain. Understanding hit Grace like a physical blow. She dropped to her knees beside the creature and buried her hands in its thick white fur. "Oh, God," she whispered, "I know who you are." The memory crashed over Grace like a tidal wave, 15 years of suppressed grief and confusion suddenly crystallizing into heartbreaking clarity. She stared into those ice-blue eyes and saw not just intelligence but recognition, and love that had never died despite years of separation and pain. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice breaking on the name. "My God, it's really you." The massive white wolf, no longer a mysterious forest spirit but her childhood companion, pressed closer against her, his enormous frame trembling with emotion. He made soft whining sounds deep in his throat, the same sounds he used to make as a puppy when he was trying to communicate something important to the little girl who had raised him from birth. Thomas Caldwell's face had gone ashen. "That's impossible. I shot that dog 15 years ago. I watched it die." "You tried to kill him," Grace said, fury building in her voice as the full horror of that day became clear. "Just like you killed my father?" "But Shadow survived, didn't he? He's been living wild in these mountains all this time." Agent Chen watched the reunion with professional interest, but even her trained skepticism couldn't deny the obvious bond between woman and animal. "This is the dog you grew up with?" Grace nodded, unable to speak, as Shadow, now easily 3 times the size he'd been as a domestic animal, gently licked her face with the same careful tenderness he'd shown when she was a child. Years of living wild had transformed him into something that looked like a wolf, but beneath the scars and muscle was still the loyal companion who had slept at the foot of her bed every night. "He was just a puppy when we found him," Grace managed through her tears. "Half wolf, half husky. My father rescued him from a trap when he was barely old enough to walk. We raised him together, trained him to track and hunt. He was more brother than pet." Samuel Youngbear's weathered face showed genuine remorse for the first time. "Now, we didn't know Jacob had brought the dog that day. When Thomas shot your father, the animal attacked. Thomas had to defend himself. So you shot an innocent animal who was trying to protect his family," Grace said, her voice hardening. "And then you let me believe for 15 years that both my father and Shadow had died accidentally." Shadow's massive head turned toward Thomas, and the growl that rumbled from his chest carried 15 years of accumulated rage. His lips pulled back to reveal teeth that had grown large and sharp from years of hunting wild game, but his eyes held a very human desire for justice. Thomas raised his hands defensively. "Grace, you have to understand, it all happened so fast. Your father pulled a gun on us when he found out about the artifacts. In the struggle, the weapon went off. Then that beast of his went crazy, trying to rip my throat out. I had to shoot it." "But you didn't kill him," Grace said, running her hands through Shadow's thick fur and feeling the ridge of scar tissue along his ribs where Thomas's bullet had found its mark. "You left him to die, just like you tried to leave me to die today." Shadow pressed against her more firmly, and Grace could feel him trembling. Not with fear, but with the effort of controlling his rage. Every instinct he'd developed as an apex predator in these mountains was screaming at him to tear Thomas apart, but his loyalty to Grace held him back. David Youngbear, still bleeding from Shadow's earlier attack, spoke through gritted teeth. "That thing nearly killed us today. Look what it did to Marcus's arm, to my chest. It's not a pet anymore, it's a wild animal." "He's protecting me," Grace replied fiercely. "The same way he tried to protect my father 15 years ago. The same way he's been protecting these mountains from grave robbers and murderers ever since." Agent Chen knelt down slowly, keeping her hands visible as she studied Shadow's scars and build. He must have been living completely wild all this time. That explains the size, the muscle development, the survival skills. A domestic dog wouldn't have lasted a week in these mountains, but a wolf hybrid with training. He's been watching, Grace realized suddenly. All these years, he's been watching the burial sites, watching for anyone who might disturb them. The Cherokee elders' stories about a white wolf spirit guardian, they were seeing Shadow. Samuel nodded slowly. The sighting started about 14 years ago. Always near the sacred places, always watching. We thought it was just coincidence. "No coincidence," Grace said, understanding flooding through her. "My father taught him to guard things. Property, people, sacred places. Even after Dad died, Shadow kept doing what he was trained to do. He's been protecting Cherokee burial sites for 15 years. Thomas's face twisted with desperate anger. "It's just a dog. A freakishly large, aggressive dog that should have been put down years ago. Don't romanticize what happened here today." Shadow's response was immediate and terrifying. He rose to his full height, which brought his shoulder level with Grace's chest, and stalked toward Thomas with predatory intent. The federal agents tensed, ready to intervene, but Grace held up a restraining hand. "Easy, boy," she said in Cherokee, using the commands her father had taught them both. "Guard, watch, but don't attack." Shadow stopped immediately, though every muscle in his body remained coiled for violence. He sat back on his haunches but kept his ice-blue eyes fixed on Thomas with unwavering intensity. "He understands Cherokee," Agent Chen observed with amazement. "My father trained him in 3 languages," Grace explained. "English, Cherokee, and hand signals. Shadow was going to be a search and rescue dog before—" Her voice trailed off as the full tragedy of what had been stolen from them hit her again. Marcus Youngbear, his mangled arm now in a makeshift sling, shook his head in disbelief. 15 years. That animal has been stalking us for 15 years, waiting for revenge." "Not revenge," Grace corrected. "Justice. There's a difference." She stood and walked to the excavation site where the Cherokee artifacts lay scattered on blue tarps. Shadow followed at her heel, his massive presence intimidating but controlled. Grace knelt and picked up a piece of pottery that looked impossibly old, a water vessel decorated with traditional Cherokee symbols. "These belonged to people," she said softly. "Actual human beings who lived and loved and died on this land centuries ago. They were buried with these objects because their families believed they would need them in the spirit world, and you turned them into merchandise." Samuel's dignity finally cracked and tears ran down his weathered cheeks. "We needed the money. The reservation is dying, Grace. Our young people leave because there's no future here. Our elders can't afford medicine. The government gives us nothing but empty promises." "So you decided to rob graves," Grace said, her voice hard as granite. "You decided that stealing from your own ancestors was acceptable if it put money in your pockets." "It wasn't like that," David protested weakly. "We were preserving Cherokee heritage. Better to sell these things to collectors who would appreciate them than let them rot in the ground." Shadow let out a sharp bark, the same sound he used to make as a puppy when he disagreed with something. The similarity to his younger self was so striking that Grace almost smiled despite the circumstances. "Even Shadow knows that's a lie," she said. "These artifacts weren't rotting. They were exactly where they belonged, with the people who were buried with them. You violated the most sacred Cherokee law there is." Agent Chen approached the excavation site with evidence bags and camera equipment. "We'll need to document everything before we can begin the repatriation process. This is going to be a massive federal case. Repatriation? Samuel asked hopefully. The artifacts will be returned to the Cherokee Nation for proper reburial, Agent Chen confirmed. That's federal law under the Native American Graves Protection Act. Grace felt a measure of satisfaction at that news, but it was tempered by the knowledge that some damage could never be undone. The sacred burial sites had been violated, the spiritual rest of ancestors disturbed. No law could repair that kind of harm. Shadow pressed against her leg again, and when she looked down, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart stop. It wasn't just recognition or loyalty, it was forgiveness. After 15 years of pain and separation, he was telling her that none of it had been her fault. "I'm sorry," she whispered to him. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. I couldn't save Dad. I didn't even know you were alive." Shadow's response was to gently take her hand in his massive jaws, not biting, just holding, the same gesture of comfort he'd used when she was a frightened child having nightmares. But their reunion was about to take a tragic turn that would test both their courage and their bond. Thomas Caldwell's face had taken on the desperate pallor of a cornered animal. As Agent Chen's team continued documenting evidence and the noose of federal charges tightened around him, his eyes darted between the approaching agents and the massive white wolf that had become the living symbol of his crimes. 15 years of carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him, and Grace could see in his expression the exact moment when desperation overtook reason. "This is all wrong," Thomas muttered, his voice rising with hysteria. 15 years I've protected this secret. 15 years I've carried the weight of what happened to Jacob. I won't let it all fall apart because of some oversized mutt. Shadow's ears flattened against his skull at the hostile tone, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Grace placed a restraining hand on his massive shoulder, feeling the tension coiled in every muscle of his body. "Thomas, it's over," she said quietly. "Just surrender." "Let the justice system handle this." "Justice?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about justice? Your father was going to destroy dozens of Cherokee families who depended on the money from those artifacts. Men with sick children, widows with no other income, elders who couldn't afford their medications. Jacob's precious principles would have condemned them all to poverty." Agent Chen stepped forward with handcuffs ready. "Mr. Caldwell, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. His hand had moved slowly toward the small of his back, where Grace now noticed the telltale bulge of a concealed backup weapon. Her military training kicked in, recognizing the subtle shift in posture that preceded an attack. "Gun!" she shouted, diving to one side as Thomas's hand came up with a snub-nosed revolver. The forest erupted in chaos. Federal agents shouted commands and drew their weapons, but Thomas wasn't aiming at them. His revolver swung toward Shadow with deadly intent, his face twisted with 15 years of accumulated hatred for the animal that had witnessed his crimes. "I should have made sure you were dead the first time," Thomas snarled. Shadow saw the threat and reacted with the lightning reflexes of an apex predator. He launched himself forward in a blur of white fur and bared teeth, covering the distance to Thomas in a single bound. But the older man had anticipated the attack and fired just as Shadow left the ground. The gunshot cracked through the mountain air like thunder. Shadow's massive body jerked in mid-leap as the bullet found its mark, but momentum carried him forward into Thomas with devastating force. Both man and animal crashed to the forest floor in a tangle of limbs and fury. Grace screamed Shadow's name as she saw blood blooming across his white coat. The bullet had caught him high in the chest, missing his heart but tearing through muscle and possibly lung tissue. Thomas's second shot went wild as Shadow's weight pinned him to the ground, the revolver spinning away into the underbrush. Federal agents swarmed the scene. But Grace was already at Shadow's side, her medic training taking over despite the emotional chaos tearing at her heart. Blood was flowing freely from the wound, and Shadow's breathing had become labored and shallow. "Stay with me, boy," she whispered, pressing her hands against the wound to slow the bleeding. "Don't you dare leave me again. Not now. Not when I just found you." Shadow's ice-blue eyes found hers, and despite his pain, his tail gave a weak wag. He tried to lift his massive head to lick her face, the same comforting gesture he'd used when she was a child, but the effort was too much. Agent Chen knelt beside them with her emergency medical kit. "I've called for a veterinary helicopter from the University of Tennessee. They have a trauma unit that specializes in large animals." "He's going into shock," Grace said, her voice clinical despite the tears streaming down her face. "We need to keep him warm and stable until help arrives." Thomas Caldwell lay pinned beneath 2 federal agents, his face bloodied from Shadow's final attack. Even injured and restrained, he continued his desperate justifications. "You don't understand what you've done. Those artifacts were funding Cherokee scholarships, medical care for tribal elders, legal fees to fight for treaty rights. Now it all disappears into government warehouses where no one will ever see them again." Samuel Youngbear, watching Shadow's labored breathing with genuine remorse, shook his graying head. "Enough, Thomas. The money was never about helping our people. It was about greed, yours and ours. We told ourselves pretty lies to justify what we were doing, but this animal bleeding on the ground is paying the price for our sins." Grace looked up from Shadow's wound, her eyes blazing with fury. "His name is Shadow. He's not that animal or some oversized mutt. He's a living being who's spent 15 years protecting these mountains from people like you. He's shown more honor and loyalty than any of you deserve." Marcus Youngbear, his own wounds temporarily forgotten, stepped closer to observe Shadow's condition. "He's not going to make it, is he? That bullet hit something vital." "He's going to make it," Grace said with fierce determination. "He survived your father's murder attempt 15 years ago. He survived 15 years alone in the wilderness. He's not giving up now." But even as she spoke the words, Grace could see Shadow's condition deteriorating. His breathing was becoming more irregular, and his eyes were losing focus. The veterinary helicopter wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes, and she wasn't sure he had that long. Shadow seemed to sense her despair. With tremendous effort, he lifted his massive head and pressed his muzzle against her cheek, just as he had done as a puppy when she was sad. His breath was warm against her skin, carrying with it the wild sense of the mountains that had been his home for so long. "I love you too," she whispered, understanding his gesture. "You saved me today. You saved me 15 years ago by surviving. You've been saving me every day since, even when I didn't know you were alive." Agent Chen worked alongside Grace to stabilize Shadow's vital signs, but they both knew they were fighting a losing battle. The bullet had caused massive internal trauma, and without immediate surgical intervention, even an animal as strong as Shadow couldn't survive much longer. "Grace," Agent Chen said gently, "you should know that what this animal did today, saving your life, protecting those burial sites all these years, it won't be forgotten. We'll make sure the Cherokee Nation knows about his service." Thomas Caldwell's bitter laughter echoed through the clearing. "Service? It's just a dog following its training. Jacob programmed it to guard things, and that's what it did. There's nothing heroic about following genetic programming." Shadow's ears perked at the sound of Thomas's voice, and despite his weakening condition, a low growl rumbled from his chest. Even dying, he recognized the voice of his father's killer and Grace's betrayer. "That's where you're wrong," Grace said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Shadow made choices. Every day for 15 years he chose to stay in these mountains instead of seeking human companionship. He chose to protect Cherokee sacred sites instead of just surviving. And today, he chose to save my life even though it might cost him his own. The sound of approaching rotor blades echoed across the valley, and Grace felt a surge of desperate hope. The veterinary helicopter was coming in fast, its crew undoubtedly prepared for emergency surgery in the field. But as the aircraft settled into the clearing and the medical team rushed toward them with their equipment, Grace could see in Shadow's eyes that he was saying goodbye. His massive head rested heavily in her lap, and his breathing had become almost imperceptible. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare leave me again. We're going to get through this together, just like we always did when we were kids." Shadow's tail gave one final weak wag. His ice-blue eyes found hers and held them with an intensity that seemed to convey 15 years of accumulated love and loyalty. Then, just as the veterinary team reached them with their life-saving equipment, his eyes closed and his breathing stopped. Grace's scream of anguish echoed across the Great Smoky Mountains, a sound of loss so profound that even the hardened federal agents turned away. The massive white wolf who had been her childhood companion, her father's avenger, and the guardian of Cherokee sacred lands was gone. But in death, Shadow would reveal one final secret that would change everything Grace thought she knew about her father's murder and the true scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. The veterinary team worked frantically over Shadow's still form, their hands moving with practiced efficiency as they attempted to restart his massive heart. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead veterinarian, administered adrenaline directly into the cardiac muscle, while her partner performed chest compressions that looked almost violent against Shadow's white coat. "Come on, big guy," Dr. Martinez muttered through gritted teeth. "Don't give up on us now." Grace knelt beside them, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She whispered Cherokee prayers her father had taught her, ancient words meant to guide spirits safely to the afterlife. But part of her refused to accept that Shadow was truly gone. He'd survived too much, fought too hard, to die now when justice was finally within reach. Agent Chen stood nearby with Thomas Caldwell in custody, watching the desperate resuscitation efforts with professional detachment. But even she seemed moved by the sight of Grace's grief and the veterinary team's determination to save an animal that had become something more than just a large dog. "Grace," Agent Chen said gently, "there's something we need to discuss. During the struggle, when Shadow attacked Mr. Caldwell, I noticed something unusual." Grace looked up from Shadow's still form, her eyes red with tears. "What do you mean?" "Your dog was wearing something, a collar but not a normal one. It looked like it was made from braided leather with some kind of metal attachments." For the first time since Shadow had collapsed, Grace focused on something other than his injuries. She looked more closely at his neck and saw what Agent Chen meant. Hidden beneath his thick white fur was indeed a collar, so weathered and camouflaged that it was almost invisible. With trembling fingers, Grace parted Shadow's fur to reveal a narrow band of braided Cherokee leather, darkened with age and wear. Attached to it were small metal objects that caught the filtered sunlight, traditional Cherokee symbols worked in silver and copper. "I've never seen this before," Grace breathed. "He wasn't wearing it when he was a puppy." Dr. Martinez paused in her resuscitation efforts to examine the collar more closely. "This looks handmade, very old craftsmanship. And see here?" She pointed to a small metal cylinder attached to the collar's side. "That's not decorative. It's functional." Grace's hands shook as she worked to remove the cylinder from Shadow's collar. It was about the size of her thumb, made of tarnished silver, and sealed at both ends with what looked like Cherokee religious symbols. The weight of it suggested something substantial was inside. "It's a message tube," she realized. "Cherokee hunters used to carry them for long-distance communication." Agent Chen immediately became alert. "Open it." carefully. Grace's fingers worked at the tube's seal, which had been designed to keep moisture out during extended wilderness travel. After several minutes of careful manipulation, the cap came free with a soft click. Inside was a rolled piece of paper, yellowed with age but still intact. As Grace unrolled the paper, her father's handwriting became visible. The careful, precise letters she remembered from his hunting journals and the notes he used to leave in her school lunches. "My dearest Grace," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then Shadow found his way back to you, and the truth about my death has finally come to light." Grace's voice broke as she read the words aloud, but she forced herself to continue. The gathered federal agents, Cherokee suspects, and medical personnel all fell silent, recognizing the gravity of the moment. "I write this on what I fear may be my last day alive. Thomas Caldwell and Samuel Youngbear have been robbing Cherokee burial sites for 3 years, selling our ancestors' sacred objects to private collectors. I have evidence of their crimes, photographs, financial records, even recordings of them discussing their operation. But I also have reason to believe they suspect I know too much." Grace paused, her throat tight with emotion. Shadow lay motionless beside her, but somehow she felt his presence, as if his spirit was listening to their father's final message. "Shadow has been trained to protect this evidence if anything happens to me. I've taught him to guard the old oak tree near Cataract Falls, the one our people call the Judgment Oak. In a hollow at its base, wrapped in oilcloth, you'll find everything needed to convict the men who betrayed our people's trust." Thomas Caldwell's face had gone ashen. "That's impossible. We searched that tree." "We searched everywhere." "You searched for artifacts," Samuel Youngbear said quietly, understanding dawning in his weathered features. "But Jacob hid evidence, not treasure." Grace continued reading through tears that made her father's words blur and shift. "I pray that you and Shadow will both survive whatever comes next. Remember that our ancestors believed death was not an ending but a transformation. If I cannot be there to guide you into adulthood, let the spirits of our people be your compass." The letter was signed with her father's Cherokee name and dated the day before his death. Dr. Martinez chose that moment to lean back from her resuscitation efforts. "I'm getting a pulse," she announced. "Weak and irregular, but definitely there." Grace's head snapped up in disbelief. Shadow's massive chest was indeed rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. His eyes remained closed, but his body showed the unmistakable signs of life returning. "Is he going to make it?" Grace asked, hardly daring to hope. "The bullet missed his heart and lungs," Dr. Martinez replied, working quickly to stabilize Shadow's vital signs. "But he's lost a lot of blood, and he's still in critical condition. We need to get him to our surgical facility immediately." As the veterinary team prepared Shadow for transport, Agent Chen organized her people to search the Judgment Oak. Grace insisted on accompanying them, clutching her father's letter like a lifeline. The hollow her father had described was exactly where he'd said it would be, a natural cavity in the oak's massive trunk, sealed with carefully fitted stones that looked like part of the tree's natural formation. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled leather, was a waterproof container holding 15 years' worth of meticulously documented evidence. Photographs showed Thomas and Samuel excavating burial sites with military precision. Financial records traced the money from artifact sales through offshore accounts. But most damning of all were audio recordings Jacob had made of their conversations, including detailed discussions of murder if anyone threatened to expose their operation. "Your father was a thorough man," Agent Chen observed as she cataloged the evidence. "This is enough to convict everyone involved and probably expose an international antiquities smuggling ring." Thomas Caldwell, faced with irrefutable proof of his crimes, finally broke down completely. "Jacob was going to destroy everything," he sobbed. 15 years of work, millions of dollars in revenue for the Cherokee community. I didn't want to kill him, but he left me no choice." "You had choices," Grace said coldly. "You chose greed over friendship. You chose murder over honesty. And you chose to let me believe my father died accidentally while you played the role of my mentor and friend." Samuel Youngbear stood with quiet dignity as Agent Chen placed him under arrest. "I'm sorry, Grace. For your father, for Shadow, for all of it. We told ourselves we were helping our people, but we became the very thing our ancestors fought against. Those who would sell our heritage for personal gain." As the federal agents processed the crime scene and prepared their prisoners for transport, the veterinary helicopter lifted off with Shadow aboard. Grace watched until it disappeared over the tree line, carrying her childhood companion toward what she hoped would be life-saving surgery. Agent Chen approached her with a satellite phone. "Grace, there's someone who wants to speak with you. Chief Patricia Walks with Eagles of the Cherokee Nation. She's been following this case for months." The voice that came through the phone was warm and maternal, carrying the authority of traditional leadership. "Child, your father's sacrifice and Shadow's courage have saved sacred places that connect us to hundreds of years of Cherokee history. Your family's honor will be remembered for generations." "Will the artifacts be returned to your people?" Grace asked. "They will be reburied with full ceremony in the places where they belong," Chief Walks with Eagles assured her. "And we're establishing the Jacob Whitehawk Memorial Fund to provide legitimate economic opportunities for Cherokee families, opportunities that don't require us to sell our souls or rob our ancestors." As the sun began to set over the Great Smoky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace stood beside the judgment oak where her father had hidden the truth and Shadow had waited 15 years to reveal it. She felt their presence in the whisper of wind through ancient leaves, in the call of birds returning to evening roosts, in the very earth beneath her feet. The truth had finally set them all free. 3 months later, Grace stood in the same spot wearing her dress uniform as the Cherokee Nation dedicated a memorial garden to her father's memory. Shadow, fully recovered and wearing a special collar marking him as an official cultural protection companion, sat at attention beside her. Thomas Caldwell was serving a life sentence for murder and federal crimes. Samuel Youngbear and his sons had received lesser sentences in exchange for their cooperation in exposing the international smuggling network. Most importantly, the sacred burial sites had been restored and protected under federal law. "Every ending is also a beginning," Grace said quietly, repeating one of her father's favorite Cherokee proverbs as she placed wildflowers on the memorial stone. Shadow's tail wagged once in agreement, and together they walked into the future, carrying the past with dignity and hope. The white wolf had kept his promise. Justice had finally come to the mountains. This story of Grace and Shadow reminds us that love transcends time, betrayal, and even death itself. For those of us who remember when neighbors could be trusted and family bonds meant everything, Grace's journey speaks to the heart of what we've lost and what we can still find again. Shadow's 15-year vigil in those mountains mirrors the loyalty we once knew in simpler times, when a handshake meant something and people kept their word. Like many of us who've watched institutions fail and trusted authorities betray that trust, Grace learned that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from governments or systems, but from the unshakable bonds we forge with those who truly know us. Her father's Cherokee wisdom that every ending is also a beginning offers hope to anyone who's faced loss, whether it's the death of a loved one, the end of a career, or the erosion of values we once held sacred. Shadow's return proves that love finds a way, that loyalty endures, and that justice, though delayed, will ultimately prevail. In a world that often feels cold and disconnected, this story reminds us that the deepest relationships, with family, with faith, with the land itself, remain our truest compass home. Have you ever experienced a reunion that changed your understanding of the past? What relationships in your life have shown you the kind of loyalty that Shadow demonstrated? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories of enduring bonds and unexpected second chances.